Hey y'all. Yeah, it's me, standing in front of a camera and not hiding behind a software screen. Welcome to what I'm reluctantly calling Part 8 of my series on Vectric software titles for the absolute beginner. I say reluctantly because while it is applicable to all of the Vectric software titles, it's also applicable to just about every piece of CAD/CAM software out there. Now, before I get started, let me go ahead and give you my standard disclaimer. That is, I am in no way sponsored nor endorsed by Vectric Limited or any other company. I'm doing this series to help the person who has never done anything like this before get into the CAD/CAM software and successfully design and finish a project within that software. So today, I'm going to kind of tread into controversial waters by discussing climb cutting versus conventional cutting, the difference between the two, and when you would use one over the other. Now, I say controversial because most of us who have been around CNC for a while have either read somewhere or seen it explained that you always get a better finish with a climb cut. And that's just not, strictly speaking, 100% true. Now, let me also say that when I'm talking in this video about materials, I'm referring to solid wood. I'm not talking about sheet goods like MDF or HDF or PVC or extruded polystyrene or high-density urethane. I'm talking about solid wood here. Also, to the more experienced woodworkers, a lot of what I'm going to talk about you probably already know. Hopefully you'll pick up a nugget here and there, but we'll see what happens. And also to you more experienced CNCers, please keep in mind that we don't all have the same equipment. You may have or have access to a machine that's perfectly capable of cutting through 1-inch thick hard maple in one pass at 200 inches per minute. Most of us don't. We're talking about folks who have the VCarve, the Shapeoko, the Shapecraft, all of these various home hobby level CNC routers just simply are not rigid enough to handle those kinds of feeds and speeds. But I've had enough questions from people who are either fairly new to woodworking or are new to CNC that I felt this kind of a discussion was warranted. So for now, let's go ahead and get a little bit closer here. I can show you some material to better illustrate what I'm talking about. Now, I've brought out a couple of pieces of material to give you a little bit better illustration of what I'm talking about here. But let's take a step back from CNC for a minute and go back into standard woodworking. Now, when you're using a handheld router in its normal operating position like this, looking down at the top of the router, the bit spins clockwise. Okay? Now, if you remember back to woodshop classes, I was taught that the way to remember how to know which direction to move the router was to approach the piece of material, the edge you're going to cut. Make a pistol with your finger, point your thumb at the edge you're going to cut. Your index finger tells you which way to move the router. That's with a handheld router. So we're going to take the handheld router, put it down, introduce the bit into the wood, and we're going to feed in this direction, move the router in this direction. That is technically cutting against the direction of rotation of the bit. That's what we want to do. This is a conventional cut. Cutting against the direction of rotation gives you that firm, easy, consistent resistance when you move the router that's easy to control. You tell the router where to go. Bringing the router backwards with the direction of rotation is a climb cut. And it's called a climb cut because when you're moving with the direction of the rotation of the bit will actually attempt to climb out of the cut. Now, with a handheld router, this is generally considered to be a very unsafe move. There are exceptions to that rule, but those exceptions are few and far between. Now, translated over to the CNC, because the router is oriented the same way with the bit pointing downwards, the same rules generally apply. We should always try to feed with the direction, introduce that bit and feed that bit with the direction of the grain. And this is where getting some experience in reading grain direction becomes necessary. Now, I brought out this example. It's a piece of yellow pine, and it has very pronounced grain direction down on this portion here. You can see the grain runs downhill towards the edge of the board. And if I tip it up onto the edge grain, you can see the grain runs upward, but again, running longitudinally this direction. That is very distinct grain direction. This is a candidate for a conventional cut. We are milling or machining with the direction of the grain. It would come all up here and do the end grain. Then up here, it gets a little bit convoluted. You will be running with the grain here until you get to this spot where we have a couple of knots that poke through the back. Here's where we're going to have the grain changing direction. And suddenly, we would be doing a climb cut here. As a whole, this piece would still be a better candidate for a conventional cut because it's easier to do a little bit of cleanup work up here on this corner than it would be to do cleanup work around the rest of the entire piece of material. So sometimes you just have to find that balance. Now, if you can flip over the piece of material, fine. But we can't always choose which side of the material we're going to have to machine for aesthetic reasons or other reasons. So, all in all, learn to read the grain and see which direction it's running and attempt to use a conventional cut whenever, wherever possible. Now, sometimes that's just not possible. You have cases like in this piece of sapele here, that included a little bit of a sapwood so that you can see this curve in the grain. So you have a piece of material here with grain going in both directions over the same length of the piece of material. This area down here would cut great on a conventional cut, but this area out here with a conventional cut would chip out like crazy. This is a good candidate for a climb cut. The thing to remember, however, with a climb cut is to take shallow passes. Now, I usually stay out of the feed rate and router RPM discussion because every machine and every tool is different. But in a situation like this, or even more so on this piece of sapele where that arch is even more pronounced and over a longer stretch of the piece of material, a climb cut taking shallow passes would be the strategy to use for this material. And when I say shallow passes, we're talking about a 32nd of an inch, maybe less. You just have to experiment with it. If you have some scrap, cut it, experiment with it, see how your machine cuts. In cases like this piece of walnut, where you have a very drastic, dramatic grain orientation change here because of this knot, that's even more apparent that this is a candidate for a climb cut with very shallow passes when doing a profile or pocketing. Now, there are those who will say that you are safe with plywood because plywood doesn't have a grain. Well, that's true and false at the same time. Plywood itself doesn't have a grain orientation, but the veneer on the surface of the plywood certainly has a grain orientation. And when you're cutting this type of material, it's the grain orientation as well as the type of bit you use that's going to decide whether you have a lot of cleanup to do or you have to scrap a piece and mount a new piece of material and try again. And this is where we get into the discussion of upcut versus downcut spiral bits. This bit is a downcut spiral, and this bit is an upcut spiral. Now, how can I tell the difference? Well, when you turn them over into their cutting position, the cutting edge is at the top of the spiral on an upcut bit. It spins, cuts, and ejects the chips and splinters upwards. The cutting edge is on the top of the spiral. Conversely, on a downcut spiral, the bit spins, the cutting edge is on the bottom of the spiral. And you can see that cutting edge on both. So a downcut bit ejects the chips downward and shears the top surface of the material downward, avoiding splintering and a lot of chip out. Again, the downcut, the cutting edge is on the bottom of the spiral. On an upcut, the cutting edge is on the top edge of the spiral. That's how you can visually tell the difference between the two. So it's a combination of being able to read the grain direction and using the proper bit for the operation you're doing that will give you a better surface, a cleaner surface that will require less sanding and less preparation for finish. Okay, now I hear some of you saying, great, Mark, that's all well and good, but I've got this nice chunk of maple burl. Now what do I do? Well, basically in situations where you have grain running in different directions all at the same time, like this piece of maple burl, a climb cut is the proper strategy to take. But again, shallow passes. Now, most of us don't have a bunch of burl hanging around that we can practice on. And in fact, it would be pretty ding-dong odd if we did. I'd love to be in that kind of a situation. In this case, I would take a conservative approach and use a climb cut with shallow passes and a medium feed rate. Something along the lines of 40 inches per minute until I see how the material is cutting. Then I can speed up or slow down that feed rate on the fly if I start getting bit chatter. Because it also depends on the diameter of the bit. If you've got a 1/2 inch bit, it's going to chatter less and be able to move faster than a 1/8 inch bit will. So any numbers I give you are kind of ballpark figures. You should learn your machine, learn your material. And, maple is going to be harder than, say, pine, fir, or cedar. But generally speaking, taking a conservative approach to start out, then speeding up if the situation allows on the fly is the better way to go. Now, taking everything we discussed outside and applying it to the software when we're creating vectors and calculating toolpaths, we have a few more things to consider. Number one being the geometry we're getting ready to cut. On straight linear lines like these rectangles or even this triangle, we can basically use the direction of the grain to decide whether we're going to climb cut or cut conventional. Now, both this triangle and these rectangles can be cut with a conventional cut. And I'll show you that here. I'll select these two, hold down Shift, and select this one. We'll go over to our toolpath tab and I'll select a profile toolpath. I've got all of this set up, my cutting depth all the way through the material. I'm using a 1/4 inch end mill, and it's going to make that cut in 6 passes. Now if I'm using that pine with the straight, even grain, this is just fine. And for this, cutting outside the vectors, I would use a conventional cutting strategy. Go ahead and calculate, enter all the rest of my information here, then calculate the toolpath. If I were going to be cutting into that sapele or that maple burl, instead I would probably want to increase the number of passes that it's going to take to cut that toolpath. Now, let me spend a little bit of time up in here. I've got my 1/4 inch end mill selected, and I'm going to take a look at the criteria of that bit by clicking Edit here. If I come over here and I look at the cutting parameters I have set for that bit, the pass depth is 1/8 of an inch. That is 1/2 of the bit's cutting diameter. My feed rate I have set at a conservative 40 inches per minute and a plunge rate set at a conservative 20 inches per minute. That's 1/2 of the feed rate. For this size of bit, that works out just fine. Now I say 40 inches per minute is conservative. It's not too slow, but it's not real fast either. I know on my machine setup outside, I can increase this feed rate on the fly. So I'll start with a conservative feed rate, see how the material is reacting to the bit, how it's cutting. Then I can bump that feed rate up or down as the material warrants. I may end up cutting this at 100 inches per minute. I may end up cutting it at 20. It's just going to depend on the material and how it's reacting to the cut. So I'll cancel this because I'm not going to make any changes there. So in the pine, 6 passes would be just fine. But if I were going to cut this in the sapele, which has that big dramatic arc, or even out of that maple burl that has grain going in all directions at once, I would want to use a climb cut. So I would select a climb cut, but then I'd also want to cut shallower. I wouldn't want to cut that at 1/8 of an inch per pass. And the way I would change this is come over here to this button and click Edit Passes. This opens up the form where you can specify your pass depth. I'm going for a total depth of cut of 0.755 inches. And this diagram here is showing me each pass. It's going to plunge down to a little more than 1/8 of an inch here, and then plunge down to a little more than 1/4 of an inch on the second pass, and go so forth and so forth. I can increase the number of passes down here where it says number of passes. Now for that maple burl, I want to go for a pretty shallow pass. So I'm going to go ahead and bump this up to 10 passes and just see how that diagram reacts. I'll click Set Passes, and I can see here I'm cutting a little bit more than 1/16 of an inch. That's still a bit aggressive for my taste, so I'll use my up arrow here and bump it up to 12, and that brings me just under 1/16 of an inch per pass. I think that'll work out much better in that hard maple burl, so I'll click OK. And now my number of passes reflects that change. I'm going to use a climb cut. I would fill in all the rest of my information here, then calculate the toolpath. Something to keep in mind is that it's very seldom that we will cut straight linear geometry like this. More often than not, we'll be cutting a lot of curves, like in this circle here or these ovals. These require a little bit more thought and a little bit more care, because in the case of this circle, it's going to cut with the grain and against the grain within the same vector. And it'll do so in quadrants. This quadrant here, you'll be cutting with that nice even grain on that pine. This quadrant here, you'll be cutting against that grain. This quadrant, you'll be cutting with, and this quadrant, you'll be cutting against. There's very little you can do about this. So on this circle or these ovals, I would use a climb cut rather than a conventional cut. So we'll go back over here to the profile toolpath, and again, whether I'm cutting the pine or I'm cutting the sapele or the maple burl, I want to use a climb cut. Now in pine, I would still want to edit my passes, but I don't need to make 12 passes. It's a softer wood. It's a little bit more resilient. I can probably bump that up to 8 passes and be okay. If I were cutting the sapele or that maple burl, I would definitely want to bring that up to 12, set my passes. And depending upon how this goes, I may even want to go to 14 or 16, especially in the case of that hard maple burl. So reading the grain, using the proper bit, and reading the vectors will help you decide the number of passes and how deep you want to cut. Go ahead and click OK. And for the sapele or the maple, I would go ahead, fill in the rest of my information here, and then calculate the toolpath. The same holds true for a pocketing toolpath, but mainly when you're talking about using a larger area clearance tool. If I want my pocket to be 1/4 of an inch deep, cutting in that pine with a 1/4 inch end mill, there you are, 1/8 of an inch deep is going to be alright. So I would still use the same feed rates and then bump them up on the fly. Click OK. It says it's going to cut it in 2 passes. We'll see how it goes. If I'm using a larger area clearance tool, I would apply it here. I don't need to select it. I think it'll be alright, but again, I would use a conventional toolpath. If I were cutting the maple or the sapele, again, I would change to a climb cut, and I would edit the number of passes. Where you run into a little bit of difficulty is in V-carving. In V-carving to a flat depth, you select your V-bit. Let's say I'm going to cut this to a flat depth of 0.25, and I'm going to use a 90-degree V-bit. That may be a little bit deep and a little bit aggressive of a pass depth for that maple or that sapele. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'll use a feed rate of 40 and a plunge rate of 20. Click OK. But I want to go back and edit this bit because there's no way of controlling how aggressive that V bit's going to cut. For my flat area clearance tool, I can go in, select a, whoops, wrong button. I can go in and select my 1/4 inch end mill because it's a fairly large circle. But again, I have no way of adjusting my depth of cut. I'll have to do that here in the edit function. A 1/4 inch for that maple and that sapele is a pretty aggressive cut. Here is where I would change that for this cut. I would come in and change that to 0.625, which means my pass depth of a 1/16 of an inch. Click OK. I would do the same here. 0.625. Click OK. And for these toolpaths, the V-bit and that 1/4 inch end mill will pocket these 1/16 of an inch per pass. I don't have any control of that over here. I have to go in and edit the bit. Now, it's very rare that we're going to cut, as I said, any geometry that are straight linear lines. Most of our toolpaths are going to be loaded with curves. The thing to take away from this is read the grain of your material. Attempt to adjust your toolpathing strategy to cut with the grain of that material as much as possible. Conventional cut when you can. If you can't, and you have to use a climb cut, shallow passes and conservative feed rates will get you the better result. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of insight into some of the decisions you have to make when trying to figure out whether to use a climb cut or a conventional cut. It's learning to read the grain of the wood that you're going to be using, learning the vectors and the bits and the depth per pass of those bits when you go to calculate the toolpaths. Now, this was never meant to be the definitive guide on what feed rates or speeds or depth per pass that you should use. It's just meant to be food for thought, things that you should consider. Your machine may be able to cut a lot deeper, a lot faster than mine. Your machine may not be able to cut as deep or as fast as mine. And every material is different. One piece of sapele, one piece of maple burl is completely different from the next. So, starting conservative and being able to bump up or down the feed rates on the fly is usually the better way to go. So, hopefully you got something out of this video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up down below. I would appreciate it. If you'd like to continue following this series, or if you'd like to follow along with some of my other CNC adventures, I hope you'll consider subscribing to my channel. Now, I know that you've noticed this bright green Holly Denny Wood Art t-shirt. If you'd like to get one of your own, and let's face it, who wouldn't? I put a link in the description below where you can get a hold of Holly herself and get you one of these highly prized t-shirts. Believe me, I get a lot of comments wearing this. I mean, come on, you can hear this color, all right? As usual, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section down below. Now, if you'd rather not leave a public comment, or you just need to get a hold of me, head on over to my website, marklindsaycnc.com, and hit that Contact Us link. I read every message that I get through marklindsaycnc.com, and I do my best to get back and reply to every single one of them. marklindsaycnc.com is sponsored by Harneal Media. They are the website and web hosting service that is geared specifically toward makers and the maker community. We're both also proud members of the Makers Media Network. So again, I hope you got something out of this video. I'd like to thank you very much for watching, and y'all take care.